The cry wasn't loud. It was thin, a needle of sound trying to stitch itself through the thick, greasy noise of the saloon. Laughter, poker chips, the off-key groan of a piano. But the cry was there, sharp and desperate, and it found its way to the one man in the room who wasn't trying to drown something out. His name was Silas. He sat at a corner table, a half-empty glass of whiskey sweating in front of him. He wasn't drinking it. He was just watching. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in a permanent twilight, but his eyes missed nothing. He saw the gambler with the hidden ace, the barmaid watering down the gin, and he saw the man stumbling through the bat-wing doors. The man's name was Jeb. Everyone in Dusty Redemption knew Jeb. He was a creature of bad luck and worse decisions, a walking ghost haunting the edges of other people's prosperity. But tonight he wasn't alone. Cradled awkwardly in his arm was a bundle of rags, and from that bundle came the cry. A baby. Jeb lurched toward the bar, nearly tripping over a spittoon. A few patrons chuckled, nudging each other. "Look what the cat dragged in," one of them slurred. "And its kitten, too." Jeb ignored them. He slammed his free hand on the worn oak of the bar, rattling the dirty glasses. "Barker," he snarled at the owner. "A drink." Barker, a man with a belly as round and hard as a barrel, folded his arms. "You ain't got the coin, Jeb, and I ain't running a charity." "Oh, I got collateral," Jeb sneered, a broken-toothed grin splitting his face. He shifted the bundle in his arm, pulling back the cloth just enough to show a tiny, sleeping face. The baby had stopped crying, lost in some fragile dream. The saloon grew a little quieter. The laughter faltered. This was a new level of low, even for Jeb. Silas watched, his hands resting flat on the table. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched, his gaze as steady and unreadable as a hawk's. Jeb held the baby up, a grotesque offering to the grime-caked ceiling. His voice, thick with cheap liquor and desperation, echoed in the sudden hush. $20, he announced. $20, and the boy is yours." The silence in the room was absolute. It was thick enough to choke on. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. The gamblers held their cards, forgotten. Every eye was on Jeb, on the tiny, helpless bundle he held aloft like a sack of grain. Barker, the saloon owner, paled. "Jeb, you're drunk. Get out of here. Take your boy and go home to your wife." "Wife?" Jeb laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "She's the reason I'm here. This mouth," he jabbed a dirty finger toward the baby, "costs money. Money I ain't got." He swept his gaze across the room, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Someone here's got to. $20. That's a bargain. He's a strong one." A woman rushed in from the street, her face pale with panic. She was thin, worn down by a life that had given her little and taken much. Her dress was patched, her hair a mess, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. "Jeb, no!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Give him to me." This was Alara, his wife. Jeb turned on her, his face twisting into a snarl. "You stay out of this, woman. This is man's business." He shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, catching herself on a table before she fell. Her eyes darted around the room, pleading. No one met her gaze. No one wanted to get between a desperate man and his despair. No one but Silas. He stood up. The scrape of his chair against the floorboards was the only sound. He wasn't a big man, not in the way that mountain men or bare-knuckle fighters were big. He was lean, built of whipcord and leather, and he moved with a quiet economy that wasted nothing. He didn't walk toward Jeb. He didn't say a word. He walked to the bar. He reached into the worn leather pouch on his belt and pulled something out. He placed it on the bar, the sound a solid, heavy thunk that cut through the tension. It was a coin, gold, a $20 double eagle, shining like a fallen star in the dim, smoky light. It was a fortune, more money than most men in that saloon saw in a month. Jeb's eyes locked onto the coin, his thirst and greed warring with his surprise. He looked from the gold to Silas, who stood there impassively, his face still shadowed by his hat. Silas didn't look at Jeb. He didn't look at the baby. He just looked straight ahead, at his own reflection in the dusty mirror behind the bar. Barker, the saloon owner, swallowed hard. "Mister," he said to Silas, his voice a low rasp, You don't have to. Silas just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear. Stay out of it. Jeb, his mind working slow through the alcoholic haze, finally understood. He snatched the gold coin off the bar, his fingers closing around it like a claw. A triumphant, delirious grin spread across his face. He shoved the baby, bundle and all, into Alara's trembling arms. He's yours now, mister, Jeb shouted at Silas, gesturing with his head toward the infant. You bought him, fair and square. Ilara clutched her child, her face a mask of horror and confusion. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. Who was this stranger? What did he want? But Silas did the last thing anyone expected. He turned his back on the baby, on the mother, on the drunk. He pushed through the batwing doors and stepped out into the night, leaving the gold coin, the baby, and the stunned silence of the saloon behind him. He hadn't bought a baby. He had just paid an entrance fee to a story he hadn't yet decided how to end. The town of Redemption settled into an uneasy night. Whispers followed Silas from the saloon. They said he was a fool, throwing good money away on a drunk's whim. They said he was a saint, paying to stop a sin without wanting a reward. They said he was just plain strange. Silas heard none of it, or if he did, he paid it no mind. He didn't ride out of town. He led his horse to the livery, paid the stable boy a silver dime for a stall in a rubdown, and then he disappeared into the shadows. He didn't go to the boarding house. He didn't find a bed for the night. He found a spot in a dark alley across from the town's sorriest excuse for a home, a dilapidated shack with a crooked porch and a roof that looked one good storm away from collapsing. It was Jeb and Alara's place, and he waited. For an hour there was nothing but the low murmur of arguing from inside. Then the sound of a sharp slap, followed by Alara's stifled cry. Silas's hand drifted to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. His fingers rested on the worn wooden grip, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. Patience was a weapon too. A little while later, Jeb stumbled out of the shack. He didn't have the gold coin. Of course he didn't. He had traded it for a full bottle of Barker's cheapest rot gut in a few hours of poker. He staggered down the street and back toward the saloon, a man determined to drink himself into oblivion. Silas stayed put. He knew this wasn't over. The moon climbed higher, a cold silver eye in the black sky. The shack's door creaked open again. It was Alara. She moved like a frightened rabbit, her head on a swivel, checking the street in both directions. On her back was a large, lumpy bundle of belongings. In her arms, she carried another, smaller bundle. But it wasn't the baby. Silas narrowed his eyes. The bundle was the wrong shape. It was too small, too rigid. It looked like a wooden box. She was leaving her child behind. Ilara scurried down the street, keeping to the darkest patches of shadow. She wasn't heading for the main road out of town. She was heading in the opposite direction, toward the edge of the prairie, where the silhouette of the old abandoned mission church stood stark against the stars. Silas melted from the alleyway, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He followed, his boots making no sound on the dusty ground. He was a ghost in her wake, his purpose still a mystery, even to himself. He just knew he had to see this through. Why was she leaving her baby? What was in that box? And why was she going to a deserted church in the middle of the night? The $20 hadn't bought freedom. It had only lit the fuse on a bomb he was just beginning to understand. The old mission church was a skeleton of a building. Its adobe walls were crumbling, and the roof had gaping holes that let the moonlight spill onto the dusty floor in pools of silver. Ilara slipped through a collapsed section of the wall, her movements furtive and desperate. Silas found a vantage point in a cluster of mesquite bushes, giving him a clear view of the church's ruined interior. Alara knelt in the center of the abandoned nave, placing the small wooden box on the ground before her. She waited, her body tense, a lone figure in a vast, empty ruin. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then Silas heard it, the soft thud of horses' hooves approaching from the north. A single rider. The man dismounted and strode into the church, his spurs ringing softly with each step. He wore a tin star on his vest. Sheriff Brody, a man known for being long on talk and short on action. You got something for me, Alara? Brody's voice was low, but it carried in the still night air. Ilara's voice was a frantic whisper. He's going to do it, Sheriff. He and the Miller brothers. They're hitting the morning stage, the one with the mine payroll. She pushed the small wooden box toward him. This is his spare pistol, and a map he drew of the ambush at Canyon Pass. Silas's blood ran cold. The Miller brothers were not small-time crooks. They were wanted killers, infamous for leaving no witnesses. Jeb wasn't just a drunk. He was running with a pack of wolves. Ilara was an informant. Sheriff Brody picked up the box, glancing at its contents. He seemed unimpressed. "This helps," he said, his tone flat. "But it ain't enough. I need to catch them in the act, red-handed." "But you promised," Ilara's voice broke. "You said if I gave you proof, you'd get me and the baby out of here. You promised me safe passage to St. Louis." The sheriff sighed, a weary, patronizing sound. "And I will, once they're caught. Once Jeb is behind bars or in the ground. Until then, you go back. You act normal. Don't give him any reason to suspect." He tossed a few small coins at her feet. They landed in the dust with a pathetic clink. "For your trouble," Ilara stared at the coins as if they were poison. "This isn't freedom," she whispered, her voice hollow with despair. "This is a death sentence. If he finds out—" "He won't," Brody said, his voice hard. "Just play your part. My posse will be waiting for them at the pass. It'll all be over by noon tomorrow." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her kneeling in the dust. Ilara didn't move. She just knelt there as the sound of the sheriff's horse faded into the distance. Then a sound tore from her throat, a choked sob of absolute, soul-crushing defeat. She was trapped. The law she had trusted was using her as bait, and the pittance he'd given her wouldn't even buy a loaf of bread. From the shadows, Silas watched. He finally understood. The $20 he'd put on the bar hadn't been a solution. It had been a blind guess in a game where he didn't know the rules. The sheriff's plan was a fool's errand. The Miller brothers would chew through a small-town posse and spit out the bones. And when the dust settled, they, or Jeb, would come looking for the person who betrayed them. Ilara was a dead woman walking. Silas waited until she gathered herself, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He waited until she started the slow, shuffling walk back toward the shack, back toward the life she was desperate to escape. Then he stepped out of the mesquite. She gasped, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her eyes were wide with terror in the moonlight, trying to make out the figure in the shadows. Silas stopped a dozen feet from her. He didn't want to spook her more than he already had. He just stood there, a tall, dark silhouette. "Heard you," Silas said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "Talking with the sheriff," Ilara trembled. I don't know what you're talking about." "He's going to get you killed," Silas stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. "A man like Brody thinks a tin star makes him bulletproof. It doesn't. And when his plan goes south, Jeb will know who talked." Tears streamed down Ilara's face now, silent and silver in the moonlight. "I have no choice," she whispered. "There's no other way out." Silas took a slow step forward. He held up his hand, not in a threatening way, but in a gesture to show he was unarmed and meant no harm. His other hand held the reins to his horse, which he had led quietly from the livery. Tied to his saddle was a second horse, a sturdy-looking mare. He held the mare's reins out to her. Ilara stared at the leather straps as if they were a coiled snake. "What? What is this?" "It's a choice," Silas said, his voice low and even. "The sheriff's way or another way." "Who are you?" she breathed, the question full of fear and a tiny flickering ember of hope. "Why did you—" "In the saloon." Silas looked away, his gaze drifting toward the distant dark horizon. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I had a sister once," he said, the words costing him something. "Her husband was a man like Jeb, full of whiskey and fists. Everyone told her to wait for the law, wait for him to change." He paused, the silence stretching out, thick with unspoken tragedy. "We waited too long." He looked back at her, and in the shadow of his hat, she saw a flicker of old banked pain. It was a pain she recognized. "The sheriff's plan is to catch them," Silas said, his voice hard again. "My plan is for you to disappear before the shooting starts." He gave the reins a little shake. Get your boy. We ride at dawn. Ilara looked from the reins to Silas's shadowed face, then back toward the shack where her son was sleeping, where her monster of a husband would eventually return. Where would we go? Not east to St. Louis, Silas said grimly. That's the first place they'll look. We ride west, straight into the fire. Her eyes widened in confusion. West? But that's where the ambush is. Exactly, Silas said, a grim set to his mouth. We're going to make sure that when the trap springs, you're the only one who walks away free. The ride west was a race against the sunrise. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, a canvas of gray rock and thorny scrub under a sky slowly bruising with the colors of dawn. Ilara rode the mare Silas had given her, her baby boy Thomas, strapped securely to her chest in a makeshift sling. She was stiff with fear, her eyes constantly darting back the way they had come, expecting to see Jeb or the sheriff's posse thundering after them. Silas rode ahead, a silent, focused guide. He moved with a purpose that unnerved her. This was more than just a whim, more than the act of a charitable stranger. There was a cold, hard calculation in the way he studied the terrain, the way he chose their path through the winding arroyos to keep them hidden from the main trail. He's not just a drunk, you know, Ilara said, her voice thin against the wind. It was the first time she'd spoken in over an hour. Silas glanced back, his expression unreadable. No man is ever just a drunk. Before the whiskey took him, she continued, as if needing to explain the monster she'd married. He was a tracker for the army. He knows these canyons better than anyone. His plan for the ambush. It won't be simple. He'll have picked a spot where the road is narrow and the rocks are loose. He'll trigger a rock slide. Trap the stage then. Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish the thought. Silas nodded grimly. And Sheriff Brody will ride his posse straight into the kill box, thinking he's the one setting the trap. They reached the ridge overlooking Canyon Pass just as the first rays of sun crested the horizon, bathing the world in a weak golden light. Below them, the stagecoach trail snaked through a narrow chasm. On the opposite cliff, partially hidden behind a jumble of boulders, were three figures. Even from this distance, Ilara recognized Jeb's shambling form. The other two, lean and wiry, could only be the Miller brothers. They were in position. They were ready. Jeb wasn't the staggering drunk from the saloon anymore. He held a rifle, and he moved with a sober man's purpose. Greed was a more powerful tonic than liquor. Silas dismounted, pulling a long spyglass from his saddlebag. He studied the scene below for a long time, his body perfectly still. She was right, he muttered, more to himself than to her. The rocks above the road. They're set to go. A few key stones knocked out, and the whole cliffside will come down. He lowered the spyglass and looked at Ilara. The rising sun caught his eyes, and for the first time, she saw their color. They were a pale, cold gray, like a winter sky. The sheriff will be coming from the east, Silas said, his voice a low hum of strategic thinking. Jeb and the Millers will let the stage pass the ambush point, then trigger the slide to block its retreat. The posse will ride right into the crossfire between the bandits and the stage guards. He paused. And when it's all over, Jeb will tell whatever law is left that his frightened wife, the informant, must have been in on it, that she set the sheriff up. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. He was right. Brody would never admit he was outsmarted. It would be easier to blame the dead woman. What can we do? She whispered, clutching her son tighter. Silas didn't answer right away. He kept staring down at the canyon, his mind working, calculating angles and possibilities. He was seeing more than just rocks and men. He was seeing a chessboard. We don't stop the trap, he said finally, his voice chillingly calm. We change who it's for. He turned to her, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Can you handle a firearm? She thought of the countless nights she'd laid awake, listening to Jeb's drunken rampages, the cold weight of his pistol on the nightstand just a few feet away. She had thought about using it 1,000 times. Yes, she said, her voice steady and clear. Silas nodded once, a gesture of grim approval. He unstrapped a second revolver from his saddle, checked the load, and handed it to her. But first, the metal was heavy and cold in her hand. It felt like damnation. It felt like hope. Good, Silas said, because by the time the sun is high, this whole canyon is going to be hell, and we're the ones who are going to light the match. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks around them. The work was brutal and fast. There was no time for rest, no time for second thoughts. Silas moved with a frantic energy that bordered on demonic. He had Elara stay with the horses and the baby, hidden in a small concealed cove, the revolver he'd given her resting on the rock beside her. He, meanwhile, became a creature of the canyon. He worked his way down the treacherous slope, moving with the silent agility of a mountain cat. He didn't go near Jeb's position. Instead, he focused on the cliff face behind the stagecoach trail, 100 yards before the ambush point. He found another section of loose shale and scree, another place where the earth was holding on by a thread. Using a long branch as a lever, he began to pry at the keystones, mimicking the very trap Jeb had set. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his shirt. He was setting a second rock slide, a counter trap. Elara watched, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What was he doing? How could this possibly work? It felt like madness. It felt like suicide. After what seemed like an eternity, Silas scrambled back up to the ridge, his face caked with dust, his hands raw and bleeding. He didn't seem to notice. "It's set," he said, his breathing heavy. "When their slide goes, it will trap the stagecoach from behind. When mine goes, it will trap them from the front." He pointed. "It will create a box. No way in, no way out." "But what about the sheriff?" Elara asked, her voice trembling. "He'll be trapped in there with them." "That's the point," Silas said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "Brody's a fool, but his men aren't. When the bullets start flying for real, they'll do their job. This can't look like a rescue. It has to look like a botched robbery where everyone got caught in the crossfire." He pulled his own Colt, the metal gleaming in the harsh sunlight. He checked the action, his movements precise and practiced. This was not the first time he had prepared for a fight. This man was no simple cowboy. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the canyon. It was the sound of heavy wheels and galloping hooves. The stagecoach. It came into view, a lumbering beast of wood and leather pulled by a team of 6 powerful horses. Two men sat up top with the driver, guards both cradling shotguns. From the other direction, Elara saw a telltale plume of dust. The sheriff's posse, riding hard. Everything was converging. "Stay here," Silas commanded her, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you do not move from this spot until I come for you. Understand?" Elara could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. Silas gave her one last, long look. It wasn't a look of reassurance. It was a look of grim resolve, the look of a man about to walk into a fire of his own making. Then he was gone, slipping over the ridge and down the other side, positioning himself on an outcrop that gave him a perfect, deadly view of the entire canyon floor. The stagecoach thundered into the narrowest part of the pass. The world exploded. From the cliff above, Jeb and the Millers sent the first rock slide crashing down. A river of stone and dust poured onto the trail, just as Silas had predicted. But it landed behind the stagecoach, cutting off its escape route. The driver hauled on the reins, the horses screaming and rearing in panic as the coach skidded to a halt. For a split second, Jeb's triumphant yell echoed across the canyon. His trap had worked. Then from the other side of the pass, a second roar answered the first. Silas's trap. Another wall of rock and debris cascaded down, blocking the trail in front of the stagecoach. The box was complete. The coach was sealed in. Jeb's yell died in his throat. Confusion turned to rage. This wasn't his plan. Before anyone could process what had happened, the shooting started. The Miller brothers opened fire from their perch, their rifle shots cracking through the air. The guards on the stage returned fire, the boom of their shotguns deafening in the enclosed space. At that exact moment, Sheriff Brody and his 5 deputies rounded the bend and rode straight into the mouth of the trap, just as the second rock slide sealed them in. They were caught on the wrong side, pinned down between the bandits on the cliff and the now fortified stagecoach. It was chaos, a whirlwind of bullets, ricochets, and shouting men. And then something happened that changed the entire equation. The side door of the stagecoach burst open, but it wasn't panicked passengers who scrambled out. It was four more men, dressed in plain, tough-looking clothes. They weren't carrying pistols. They were carrying repeating rifles, and they moved with the disciplined precision of trained soldiers. The lead guard up top, the one who had seemed like a simple shotgun messenger, yelled a command. He didn't sound like a stagecoach guard. He sounded like a captain. He tossed his shotgun aside, pulled open the payroll strongbox, and instead of gold, he started passing down more rifles and boxes of ammunition. They weren't guards. They were Pinkertons. The mine payroll wasn't just bait for Jeb and the Millers. The entire stagecoach was a Trojan horse. The law wasn't Sheriff Brody's bumbling posse. It was this squad of hardened agents who had been waiting for the ambush all along. The tide of the gunfight turned in an instant. The Miller brothers, who thought they were picking off easy targets, were suddenly facing a volley of disciplined, overwhelming firepower. One of the brothers cried out and slumped over, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Jeb, seeing his glorious payday turning into a bloodbath, panicked. His greed evaporated, replaced by pure, cornered animal fury. His eyes scanned the canyon, wild and desperate, looking for an explanation, for someone to blame. And then he saw her, high up on the opposite ridge, a flicker of movement, a woman's shape, backlit by the sun. Ilara. He didn't see Silas, who was hidden in the rocks 100 yards to her left. All he saw was the wife who had betrayed him. A terrible guttural roar of pure hatred erupted from Jeb's throat. You! He forgot the Pinkertons. He forgot the sheriff. He forgot the money. He raised his rifle, swinging the barrel away from the battle below and aiming it straight up the cliffside, straight at the mother of his child. The world seemed to slow down. Silas saw it happen. He saw Jeb pivot, saw the rifle come up, saw the unmistakable intent in his posture. "Get down!" Silas roared, his voice drowned out by the cacophony of the gunfight. He fired his own revolver, not at Jeb, but at the rock near his head, trying to spoil his aim. The bullet sparked off the stone, inches from Jeb's face. But it wasn't enough. Jeb's rifle cracked, a whip-like sound that cut through the deeper booms of the other guns. Silas shoved Alara to the ground a split second before the bullet whizzed through the air where her head had been, smacking into the rock behind them with a vicious puff of dust. The firefight below was a maelstrom, but for Silas it faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was Jeb, a man consumed by a singular, murderous purpose, scrambling up the rocks toward them. The remaining Miller brother and the Pinkertons were locked in a deadly exchange. Sheriff Brody and his men were pinned down, useless, just trying to stay alive. Silas rose from his cover, firing his Colt in a steady, measured rhythm. Each shot was aimed, each one designed to suppress, to control, to dominate the space around him. He wasn't just a cowboy who knew how to shoot. He was a master of the craft. His movements were fluid, deadly, economical. He dropped to one knee, sighted, and fired. The second Miller brother, trying to flank the Pinkertons, spun around and collapsed. But while Silas was dealing with the professionals, Jeb, the amateur, the drunk, was closing the distance. Fueled by rage and whiskey-laced adrenaline, he ignored the bullets zinging past him. He dropped his rifle, which was too cumbersome for the climb, and pulled a hunting knife from his belt. His face was a mask of insanity, his eyes fixed on Alara, who was struggling to her feet, the baby crying against her chest. Silas saw him. He took aim, but a ricochet from below sent a shower of rock fragments into his face, blinding him for a crucial second. He staggered back, wiping the blood and grit from his eyes. When his vision cleared, Jeb was only 20 feet from Alara. Too close. Silas was too far away, his angle cut off by a spire of rock. He was not going to make it in time. Ilara backed away, her heel catching on a loose stone. She fell, landing hard on her back, the air knocked from her lungs. The baby Thomas let out a terrified wail. Jeb was on her in an instant, his shadow falling over her, the knife raised high. His face was a twisted ruin of hate. "I'll kill you both," he screamed, his voice raw. "You and the little bastard." He lunged. This was not the cowering, beaten woman from the saloon. This was not the weeping, hopeless victim from the ruined church. The woman who looked up at Jeb was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of this violent morning. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something else rose to meet it, a fire, a mother's protective rage. As Jeb brought the knife down in a vicious arc, Ilara didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She rolled hard to her left, the knife burying itself in the dirt where she had been a moment before. In the same motion, her hand closed around the heavy metal object Silas had given her, the revolver. Jeb grunted in frustration, pulling the knife free. He turned ready to lunge again. He froze. Ilara was on one knee now. The pistol was in her hand, held steady with a two-handed grip. The barrel was not shaking. It was pointed directly at the center of his chest. Her eyes, filled with all the pain and terror he had ever inflicted on her, were as cold and hard as river stones. For a heartbeat, all the sound in the canyon seemed to vanish. There was only the sight of the husband and the wife, locked in a final, terrible tableau. "No more, Jeb," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unshed tears and 1,000 silent screams. He stared at her, then at the gun, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He actually laughed, a short, barking sound. "You wouldn't," he spat. "You ain't got the—" The roar of the pistol cut him off. The shot was deafeningly loud. The gun bucked in her hands, but her grip held. A small, dark hole appeared on Jeb's filthy shirt. His eyes went wide with a comical look of surprise, as if he'd just remembered something important he'd forgotten. He looked down at his chest, then back up at her. The hatred in his face dissolved, replaced by a blank, stupid confusion. He took one stumbling step backward, then another. His heel found no purchase on the edge of the rocky ledge. He fell, tumbling end over end down the cliffside without a sound, a broken puppet whose strings had been cut. He landed in a heap on the canyon floor below, still and silent. The gunfight was over. The last Miller brother had surrendered. The Pinkertons were securing the scene, their efficiency a stark contrast to the sheriff's bewildered-looking posse. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the horses and the soft, hiccuping cries of baby Thomas. Ilara slowly lowered the gun, her arm trembling from the strain. Smoke curled from the barrel, smelling of sulfur and finality. She looked down at her son, who was safe, and a deep, shuddering sob escaped her. It was a sound of grief, of terror, of relief, of a freedom so profound she didn't yet have a name for it. From below, a voice called out, sharp and clear. "Silas, took you long enough to join the party." Ilara looked down. The man who had shouted was the lead Pinkerton, the one who had looked like a simple stagecoach guard. He wasn't looking at the wreckage of the battle. He was looking straight up at the rock spire where Silas stood, and he was smiling, a tired, knowing grin. Sheriff Brody stared, his mouth agape. He looked from the dead bandits to the squad of professional agents, then up at the mysterious, silent cowboy on the ridge. You know him?" he stammered to the Pinkerton leader. The agent, whose name was Marcus, holstered his pistol. "Know him?" he said with a dry chuckle. "This whole damn operation was his idea." Silas made his way down the slope, his movements wary but sure-footed. He stopped beside Ilara, gently taking the revolver from her trembling hand. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a small, brief nod. It was a nod of respect, of understanding. Marcus and two of his agents met them as they reached the canyon floor. The sheriff trailed behind, looking utterly lost. "Your information was good, Silas," Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder. "The Miller gang is finished." He glanced at Ilara and the body of Jeb. "Things got a little more complicated than you planned, though." "They always do," Silas replied, his voice flat. "Who is he?" Sheriff Brody demanded, finally finding his voice. "What is he to you?" Marcus turned, his gaze withering. "This is Silas Kane. He was, until 2 years ago, the best tracker and field agent the Pinkerton Detective Agency ever had." A collective gasp went through the posse. Silas Kane wasn't just a name. He was a legend, a ghost story whispered by outlaws, a man credited with bringing down a dozen of the most notorious gangs in the territory. "He quit," Marcus explained, his eyes on Silas. "Walked away after the job in Colorado. Said he was tired of cleaning up messes. The local law was too scared or too stupid to handle themselves. The jab at Brody was unmistakable. Silas's story about his sister suddenly clicked into place with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a story, it was the reason. Her husband, the abusive drunk, must have been tied to a gang. The local sheriff, probably a man just like Brody, had failed to act, and she had paid the price. The Pinkertons couldn't save her because their hands were tied until a federal crime was committed. So Silas had quit an organization that forced him to wait. He had come to redemption tracking the Millers, knowing they would eventually make a move on the payroll. He had seen the situation with Jeb and Alara, and it was history repeating itself. The same pattern, the same danger. Only this time, he wasn't going to wait for the law to fail. The $20 in the saloon wasn't a random act. It was his first attempt to intervene, to break the cycle. He was trying to give Alara the means to run before the violence erupted. But she was already caught in the sheriff's web, so he had turned to Plan B. He had used Brody's informant, used the Pinkertons' trap, and used his own knowledge of the canyon to orchestrate the entire confrontation. He had built a better box, one designed not just to catch the guilty, but to protect the innocent. "You used me," Brody sputtered, his face red with humiliation. "You used my town." Silas turned to face him, his gray eyes as cold as a grave. "Your informant was going to end up dead," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You put her in a cage with a pack of wolves and told her to hope for the best. I just made sure she was the one who had the gun." The fight went out of Brody. He had nothing to say. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and exposed. The morning sun was high and hot now, beating down on the canyon of broken men and shattered plans. The Pinkertons were efficient, gathering their prisoners and tending to the wounded. The whole affair would be written up as a successful joint operation, of course. Brody would likely even get some of the credit, just to keep things quiet. But everyone there knew the truth. Marcus walked over to Silas. He was holding a heavy canvas bag that clinked with the sound of coin. "There was a substantial bounty on the Millers," he said. "The agency has authorized a finder's fee for services rendered." He held the bag out to Silas. Silas looked at the money, then at Alara. She was standing a little ways off, comforting her baby, a lone figure of quiet strength amidst the carnage. She was looking at the distant horizon, as if seeing a future she had never dared to imagine. He took the bag from Marcus, walked over to her, and held it out. "This is yours," he said softly. Alara looked at the bag, then at him, her eyes wide. "No, I can't. You, you saved us." "I didn't do this for money," Silas said. "Freedom isn't bought with $20 in a saloon. It's bought with this." He gave the bag a little shake. "A new start, a train ticket as far away from this life as you can get, a place where nobody knows your name or his." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or despair. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Silas said. He reached out, his rough fingers gently touching the baby's cheek. "Just raise him to be a good man, better than his father." He looked at her one last time. "Better than me." He turned before she could reply. He walked to his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and didn't look back. Marcus called out to him, "Where will you go, Silas?" Silas paused, looking west, toward the vast, empty expanse of the frontier. "Somewhere quiet," he said, and then he nudged his horse forward, riding out of the canyon and into the shimmering heat haze. A lone rider who had sought redemption not for himself, but for a stranger. Ilara watched him go until he was just a tiny speck against the horizon. She clutched the bag of money in one hand and her child in the other. She had her freedom. It had been paid for in gold, in blood, and in the quiet resolve of a cowboy who had refused to let history repeat itself. The price was high, but for the first time in her life, the future was truly her own. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe.